Dana asked me to talk a bit about the Ibogaine deaths, quote unquote, that have been reported. Um, and I was thinking of making PowerPoint slides and looking at the 17 to questionably 32 deaths that have been reported. But I'd rather talk about what the generalities and safety and a model of Ibogaine that would be safe to do in the United States, inexpensive, where nobody dies. So Dana asked me to start with the St. Kitts experience. My earliest experience with psychedelics was somewhere in the early 1980s, had a mystical experience, went to seek some indigenous cultures in Mexico, peyote cultures, and that first psychedelic experience affected everything I did in my medical career. It was before I went to medical school, literally on my way to medical school, that I had that experience. And the fields I chose to go into were chosen because of the ethics that I learned through psychedelic medicines. Yet when I came back to the United States, I saw the way medicine was being practiced here. I trained in internal medicine and cardiology and said, I don't want to do that. That's so much of this is wrong. It's just not proper thinking. We're truly in the sickness business and not in the wellness business. So here we are some, let's say, approximately 12 to 15 years after the reason I become an MD. I kind of realized no one was going to listen to me if I didn't have any credentials. And I became an MD after getting a master's at NYU and really thought of the benefit of psychedelic medicines in terms of someone to heal their own brain. And I coined a term back then called neuropsychiatric immunology. And when I did my first psychiatric rotations as a resident in New York City, I saw equivalent of a horror show. I said, what you're doing to these patients is a sin against God. I mean, it was horrific. I went home. I remember that first day of rotating in a state university in New York, SUNY downstate Brooklyn, New York psych ward, and saying, oh my God, this is jail with medication. And thinking that somebody could literally have a bad day, get arrested, be placed in the psych ward. They would inject them with Thorazine and continually give so much Thorazine that 20 years of your life could pass by and no one would realize that there's nothing mentally wrong with you. So interestingly enough, I chose to go into the field of emergency medicine. It was very in sync with my ethics because when somebody comes in with an acute anything, from a cut to a heart attack to a gunshot to a head trauma, there's very little question, do they need help? What should the help be? What should the long-term plan be? And I spent a decade or more working as a director of various emergency rooms. Serendipitously, I had a neck operation in '95 and took some time off. And a patient of mine who was a woman healer in a shamanic type of way asked, I was borrowing office space from a friend of mine, and she was a patient of this other doctor, and said, can I become your patient because I see you have Vivitrol pictures on the wall, and I think you're more in sync with my plan of health. She wound up meeting Dr. Deborah Mash through some very bizarre set of coincidences, and had my first meeting with Dr. Mash, who tells me she has a psychedelic drug from Africa that will stop opiate withdrawal in 24 hours. And I remember saying to her, and I have a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. I did not believe it. I had already myself been a person in recovery, having to get off opiates myself many years before I met Dr. Mash. And it was the hardest thing I could do. I saw this painful US model back then. So back then, if somebody had to detox in the United States, we would put them in a hospital facility or a licensed agency for healthcare administration approved detox facility. And I was able to use powerful opiates to get them off opiates. Drugs like methadone, dihydromorphone. About 20 years ago, the US government changed the law that said you can no longer use I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the DEA classifications of drugs, class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So all illegal drugs are class 1. Ibogaine is still a class 1. So is cannabis still a class 1. But real narcotics like methadone and morphine and dihydromorphone elixir and things of this nature are class 2 drugs. They made a law that said detoxers are no longer able to use class 2 drugs, and even in a hospital setting, to do a pharmaceutically assisted detox, even in a hospital. So, and this happened. Why did this happen? Why would the US government be so absurd to say that I can't use opiates to get people off opiates, leaving nothing but a cold turkey miserable kick? Because detox business was becoming a big business in the United States. Everybody was opening up detoxes. So instead of running high quality detox, the level of quality of US detoxes decreased, and there were very few, and I am talking about less deaths in the United States detox model than we even had Ibogaine deaths, and the US government and the DEA felt obliged to step in and say you can no longer use class 2 drugs to get people off class 1 and 2 drugs. So what the detox centers did, nobody paid much mind and nobody put up a big fight, because we switched over to using dihydrocodone elixir, which is literally codeine liquid. And it worked. You had to use a lot more of it, but it worked because it was a class 3 drug. So for about the next 10 years, detoxers were using dihydrocodone elixir to detox patients off opiates. It took longer, it wasn't as comfortable, but it was possible. Approximately 5 years ago, because we started to see a massive amount of abuse of Vicodin, doctors writing Vicodin scripts, which is dihydrocodone, that the DEA bumps dihydrocodone up to a class 2 drug. So this means right now in the US model, if you're an opiate addict and you want to go to a detox, there is no drug that you can get in detox period other than buprenorphine, which is Suboxone. And so this is a question I ask. Somebody comes to me, I've been taking Suboxone 16 milligrams a day for 2 years. How do I get off? Well, somebody who even says I have $100, $200, $300 a day street heroin, quote, fentanyl habit, the thought that I'm going to put them into a lockdown detox for 7-10 days and give them tapering doses of Suboxone and they're going to be detoxed is literally ridiculous. So we are right now in a position in the United States where we've gone, I'd like to say 50 years backwards, but I actually think we have never been in the history of medicine in such a horrific state where you're not allowed to use any narcotics to get people off narcotics. And the reasons for this being is the US government considers keeping people addicted to buprenorphine, i.e. drugs like Subutex, Suboxone, Bunavail, there are several others. That's the best any addict can do.
Vivitrol shot.
Excuse me?
Vivitrol shot.
Well, no, if I give a Vivitrol shot to somebody in Suboxone, Dana, I will throw them into permanent, irretractable opiate withdrawal for 30 days. They will be in hell and usually buy a gun on the street and blow their brains out.
I'm not talking about
So, okay, so let me explain this Vivitrol naltrexone implant to everybody here. You know, when somebody overdoses on opiates, they get a shot of Narcan and instantly, literally within seconds, if you give it intravenously, they wake up in 1 second. So because it's a pure antagonist on across all opiate receptors, mu, kappa, delta, gamma. And I've seen people, blue, purple, hundreds of times as an ER doctor, and other times since I've given Narcan to people and seen, within seconds, they are awake and they're in acute opiate withdrawal. So about 15 years ago, somebody came up with the idea of long-acting Vivitrol, which is depot Narcan, basically. And if you gave these shots to alcoholics who are detoxed, When they drank again, they didn't get that alcohol buzz. So we used to have a saying, the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, and then the drink takes the man. In the case with naltrexone, so Vivitrol as a monthly shot, it's a shot you get every 28 days. It gives a very, very good steady state. Every day of that month, you have pretty much the same amount of Narcan or naltrexone in your system. And the study showed that alcoholics who took Vivitrol shots had a much better sustainable sobriety rate than alcoholics who didn't. I was very skeptical of this, and the company came to me and I looked at their research and it seemed to make sense to me. Then approximately 5 to 10 years after Vivitrol, or the long-acting monthly Narcan shot, was approved for alcoholism, it got approved for opiate addicts. But if you give it to somebody who's actively on opiates, it will throw them into something we call precipitated withdrawal. So for patients who are on Suboxone, they must be off Suboxone for at least 7 to 10 days before they get their first Vivitrol shot. And every time we give a Vivitrol shot in my office, and we probably give 100 Vivitrol shots a month, we drug test the patient to make sure they have not relapsed, because if in fact they've relapsed and I give them that shot, it's going to throw them into permanent withdrawal. Now, it was counterintuitive to me why Vivitrol would work for opiate withdrawal. If I'm locking on a long-acting antagonist, the opposite of an opiate to opiate receptors, if withdrawal is, I've shut down my own opiate manufacturing plant in my brain because I've been taking so much exogenously from the outside, and it takes 90 days to make these natural endorphins and enkephalins again. If I have a blocker on that site, I would think withdrawal would be worse, and I would never feel well again if I took the Vivitrol shot. And to this day, I don't understand why, but I do have to tell you that in every group studied, and I've been looking at this for decades now, the Vivitrol group does better every time. So Vivitrol is only indicated for alcoholics who are already off alcohol, or opiate addicts who are already off of their opiates and can prove that they are out of opiate withdrawal. Because if you give it to anybody during opiate withdrawal or while they're on opiates, you will throw them into permanent, intractable withdrawal. One of the things we were worried about in the beginning when this drug came out is that people would want to get high and they try to override the Vivitrol or the Narcan. And because literally, if you use fentanyl or heroin while you're on Vivitrol, you don't get a buzz. If you drink, you won't get a buzz. It seems to be a pretty good shot. And when it first came out, I used to say, don't give Vivitrol to patients 90 days post-Ibogaine, because we didn't know if Ibogaine was actually a pseudo-irreversible agonist of mu and kappa opiate receptors. So if I gave a patient Vivitrol right after Ibogaine, I might be taking away that 60 to 90 day, euphoria that goes along past flood dose of Ibogaine. So I've seen some patients do this. They got Vivitrol elsewhere and they were still doing well. So the new model is, if somebody is really at high risk for relapse, a lot of Ibogaine centers, do give Ibogaine to patients. They fly home, but nobody has told them that they've got an incurable disease, that they can be arrested one day at a time by incorporating certain spiritual principles in their life. And relapse rates for people who take Ibogaine is extremely, extremely high. If you give the patients a shot of Vivitrol right after Ibogaine, literally within 7 days post a flood dose, those patients seem to have a better recovery rate than the patients who don't. So in Russia, about 15 years ago, somebody came up with, this company who makes Vivitrol, which is, again, depot naltrexone, has a patent on this drug, and it's an expensive shot. It's about $400 a month for a shot, but insurance companies, US insurances across the board, Medicare, Medicaid, anything, pay for it. But if you don't have insurance, it's a very expensive shot to get. The medication does exist. It's a pill called Revia. The pill does not work very well because it doesn't get absorbed very well from the GI tract. So taking it orally doesn't work very well. And if somebody wants to get high, they just stop taking their pills. So some doctors in Russia started to say, why don't we just make an implant that will last for a year and implant it, 1 year naltrexone implant and put it into people's skin, and they'll have naltrexone on board all year round. The problem I have with these implants, and this is why I never use implants, I only use the Vivitrol shot. When I give somebody a shot, I know exactly how much they have in their system. I know the pharmacokinetics of that shot. I know that shot actually lasts for 28 days. I've seen some of these implants fall apart within 30. People want to have them extracted and they fall apart. So no major quality drug company is actually making, naltrexone implants that last. There was a company out of New Jersey that got a patent from the FDA to make a 3-month implant. It was absurdly expensive. And putting this implant in and taking it out is a major surgical procedure. So it's not an easy thing to do. It's much easier in my mind to just get a shot in the ass once a month. But so much for the naltrexone implant. Dana, the implant does not work for benzos. It doesn't work for methamphetamines. It doesn't work for cocaine. It works for opiates and alcohol only.
No, that's why I don't know why they were trying to give something like that. But
They're trying to say that Suboxone, we should be giving crackheads Suboxone too. Let's turn, cocaine addicts into opiate addicts. These drug companies would like to say that these medications are panaceas for all sorts of addiction, but they're not.
their $1.4 billion fine was reduced by Donald Trump to $600 million, but they had to pay it. And that's Rick and Benkeiser, and they're the ones who blocked Ibogaine in 1996.
Rick and Benkeiser is the maker of basically.
Like, clarify one thing. They both Vivitrol and buprenorphine are variations on the paramorphine molecule. So they actually really resemble each other closely, even though one is a complete blocker and one is an agonist antagonist.
So let me explain to those who don't know why is buprenorphine, why do people on methadone in the United States have to go to a methadone clinic every single day to drink their monkey juice? And any patient can go to a doctor and walk away with a 90-day supply of Suboxone on the first visit. You cannot overdose on Suboxone. You cannot overdose on buprenorphine. It's a full agonist on the kappa receptor, but it's an antagonist on the mu receptor. So there is no respiratory depression, but there is some sort of dysphoria associated with it. And I have some patients who are now in their late 70s who have been on Suboxone for 25 years with no chance of actually ever getting off this drug. And then when they go to hospitals for surgeries, they say they're on this medication and the hospitals don't have the medication in their formulary. So it's truly a big problem. So this drug got easily approved because nobody can overdose from it, and it's a lot easier than getting methadone. In the United States, for those of you who are not United States residents, you can only get you can't get methadone from a doctor's office. You have to go to a DEA-controlled, federally licensed methadone clinic, where literally you have to show up at 6 o'clock in the morning, wait online, drink your juice. After a year of clean urine, staying on methadone, they allow you to come 3 times a week. And after 5 years, maybe, you can come 1 time a week. In Florida, you have to go at least once per week after 5 years on methadone. I believe in New York City, they allow 30-day take-homes now. But still, it's a difficult system. If we wanted to save lives, we should allow doctors to prescribe methadone from their office, but they're so afraid that methadone is going to be diverted. And Suboxone does get diverted to some degree, but it gets diverted to addicts who are trying to detox themselves because they don't have money to go to doctors. So this is how, the only option an opiate addict has in the United States today is to be on buprenorphine, Subutex, Suboxone, Zubsolv, Bunavail, or one of these other medications. And it's a horrible protocol, because somebody who's trying to taper off this medication, if the company who made the drug really wanted the people to get off the drug, you'd think they would make it in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 milligrams. But they don't. They make it in 2 and 8 milligrams. So how are you supposed to, how do I go from 8 to 7 milligrams? How do I go from, from 7 to 6.5 milligrams? How do I do a slow taper if various dosages of this medication don't exist? And this was done very specifically because the drug company who makes the drug does not want to see people taper off. When the drug eventually, instead of being a tablet, became a film that you put on your tongue, I started teaching doctors how to cut the films. If I take an 8 milligram film and fold it into 4 equal pieces, I have 4 2 milligram pieces. And I tell patients to cut a 2 milligram strip off and go from 8 milligrams to 6 milligrams on a slow taper model. When Reckitt Benckiser heard that I was doing this, they would no longer allow me to be a speaker for them at their conferences. So much for the business of, how nasty this gets. But we in the United States, we have never been in the history of addiction, we have never been in a worse place in the United States in terms of rational thinking, to help any opiate addict at all, because there's just no way for an opiate addict who has a major habit. So we have fentanyl out there that's 100 times stronger than heroin. The addictions are stronger than ever. And yet you go to detox, and your best hope is to leave detox addicted to Suboxone. I just switched seats on the Titanic. And their model is, well, this is harm reduction because nobody dies, but you stay addicted and you stay depressed and miserable for the rest of your life. So it's just amazing to me that the addiction world is not screaming at the US government to allow us to use class 2 drugs again to detox patients off opiates. I mean, it's so absurd, because detox was difficult enough and hard enough prior to this law that said I can no longer use class 2 drugs to get people off class 1 and 2 drugs. Suboxone is still a class 3 drug, so it can be phoned in, it's easily obtainable. Going back to the story, so in '96, Dr. Mash tells me she has this psychedelic drug that can get people off opiates. Now, Dr. Mash is a PhD, a scientist of renown from University of Miami. She's head of the brain bank, and I believe she was head of Parkinson's research at the time. And where was she going to find a doctor who knew everything about cardiology, knew about how to detox patients, and could handle pretty much any emergency situation that could arise? She got permission from the premier of the island of St. Kitts in the British West Indies to put Ibogaine into their national pharmacopoeia. And we started doing rounds. Once a month, we would try to gather 10 to 14 patients, get their labs, get their EKGs, and they would all come down to the island of St. Kitts. We had about a 5-acre piece of property that had a barbed wire fence around it, and it was like Camp Ibogaine. And to Dr. Mash's credit, it was done very well. There were a lot of good therapists there, psychiatrists, myself, other doctors, and there was a real psycho-spiritual model to this. What she didn't tell anybody, and she doesn't say to this day, every one of those patients who went to St. Kitts paid to go there. This was not a clinical trial. Okay, this was a for-profit company called Healing Visions, and then it was changed its name to Healing Transitions. And each one of those patients paid somewhere between $8,000 and $14,000 for their stay at St. Kitts and how to take Ibogaine. And since we didn't know what we were doing, we really didn't know a lot about what we were doing. Some Ibogaine treatments had been done in Panama before and some other places. We knew it had some cardiac side effects. It caused people's blood pressures to drop. It caused bradycardia, decrease in pulse. We started off with extreme safety from the beginning to the end. We did EKGs, we did complete screenings. Anybody who had elevated liver enzymes, more than 2.5 times normal, was ineligible to take Ibogaine, because Ibogaine is broken down by the liver. The patients, when they got to St. Kitts, they were kept on liquid methadone. So imagine I have 14 opiate addicts in an island of St. Kitts, and these patients are going to be treated, some of them, all of them, in the next 8 to 10 days. We would treat 4 patients a day, but these patients are arriving there with no heroin, no opiates, no oxy, no methadone, whatever they might have been taking. So we had to keep them comfortable until the day that they received their flood dose. So that means medicating them with liquid morphine every 4 hours, around the clock, 24 hours a day. And that's something that Dr. Mash didn't know how to do in the beginning, but she rapidly learned from me. And we did it pretty well. So I remember that first round going down to Ibogaine. I saw a couple with a massive heroin habit, and they were crack addicts, take a flood dose of Ibogaine and tell me the next morning they felt fine. And I remember it as if it was yesterday. I saw nothing short of a miracle. At the time, I called it the most important discovery in the history of addiction medicine, and I still believe that to this day. We have 100,000 deaths last year, not even last year, 2020. I think it will be 130,000 when they do the numbers for 21. The fentanyl is stronger than ever. People are dying on $5 worth of, fake oxy. So Ibogaine is needed more than ever. So these patients in St. Kitts all had an intravenous line in using fluids to keep their blood pressure up, because Ibogaine causes low blood pressure. So if you give physiologic fluid like salt water, normal saline, or Ringer's lactate, you help keep that patient hydrated during this 18 to 24 hours that they're lying in a bed after they take their flood dose of Ibogaine. All of the patients, from patient 1 to patient 300 and something, were all on a 3-lead cardiac monitor. We saw very early that Ibogaine caused 3 things were very clear. Ibogaine produced bradycardia, slowing of the heartbeat. So if, let's say, your normal pulse is 77, I used to see patients frequently drop their pulses to 20 or 30, which is inconsistent with pumping brain to your blood. It also caused hypotension, low blood pressure. So let's say the patient's normal blood pressure would be 140/90, and all of a sudden on Ibogaine, they're 80/50. The third thing we noticed that Ibogaine was a QT prolonging drug. Now, medicine already knew about QT prolongation. It's the time marked on an EKG where after your heart beats, how long does it take to reset so it can accept electrical activity for the next beat? Ibogaine is a potent QT prolonging substance, and so are 200 to 300 other drugs in the United States, as well as certain natural substances like grapefruit juice. So many substances that are metabolized by the same system in the liver that metabolizes Ibogaine cause QT prolongation. So I'm spending 5 to 7 days of my time every month going to St. Kitts to assist Dr. Mash. So nobody got dosed. So Deborah would spend 10 to 14 days down there babysitting these patients from day 1 to the day everybody went home. I would show up the day before the first patient had their flood dose and leave one day after the last patient was treated, because the risk was involved during treatment, and that's when she needed me there. And why did I give my time and effort to do this? Why? Because I thought Ibogaine was the cure for opiate dependence. I still think Ibogaine is a cure for opiate dependence. And I became president of Florida Society of Addiction Medicine and maintained other positions of renown in the addiction world in the United States. And I took Deborah with me, and we started lecturing all over the United States at any conference we could about Ibogaine, telling other addiction doctors in the United States, Europe, and other places about Ibogaine. Deborah used to call it the Deborah and Jeff Dog and Pony Show. And the reason I did this was I was told by this doctor that this was going to be our gift to the world, that she needed I'm not a researcher like she is. She's a PhD and she's published many papers. I'm a doctor that treats patients. I don't write research papers. I was told that when we treat enough patients that these numbers become statistically valid, that she would say, you and I are going to go in front of NIDA and the FDA. We're going to present this data. And the data was so good and so legitimate and not fudged. It was really great, legitimate, authentic, true data that it can't be ignored. So St. Kitts closed something approximately, I'm just guessing now, about 17 years ago. We had done enough patients. The vibe of the place was turning south. We had already been open for 5 or 6 years. And again, these patients paying. And nobody was checking the finances of where this money went or anything else like that. So 6 months after St. Kitts closed, Deborah, where's the data? I'm crunching it. A year goes by. Deborah, where's the data? I'm crunching it. It takes money to crunch the data. And this is, yes, you have to hire a statistician and things like that. And eventually, when we get to, I don't know if it was 1 year or 2 years or 1.5 years, I was actually told, listen, this is my data. And nobody ever paid me a penny to do all this research. And I'm not going to give away this data till I have, I think it was quoted $750,000 in the bank or something like that. So I was like, really? I thought this was going to be our gift to the world. We were going to give this information away to save lives. Well, it never happened. Deborah opened up several other companies, Nova Neuron, DemRx, which is now owned by Atai Life Sciences. And still, in her vision, I'm not saying anything negative about, trying not to say anything negative about her. She didn't believe that was a viable pathway to this drug becoming in the United States, that it would take, a lot of money to do this. And so here we are now, approximately 17 to 20 years later, with Ibogaine being no closer. These companies had collected over $30 million in investor money, and no research on Ibogaine was really done. They said they spent all that money on patents and legal things and lawyers to own the rights to Ibogaine, not to actually prove that Ibogaine works. And I think we're still in the same situation where everybody's trying to own the rights to Ibogaine instead of, looking at the fact that Ibogaine is a cure for opiate dependence. Now, I make this very clear. People often will make the statement, Ibogaine is the cure for addiction. I do not believe Ibogaine is the cure for addiction. How you cure addiction is something you do on a daily basis after you get clean. Ibogaine can bring patients very quickly to a stage of readiness for change. And the most important thing about Ibogaine, it is the cure for opiate dependence. So it would take me 90 days to do in a US model of detox, I can do in 12 to 24 hours with a single flood dose of Ibogaine. But I realized very quickly by 1998, 1999, that Ibogaine carries some severe risk of people possibly dying under a flood dose of Ibogaine. Why? Because many times in St. Kitts, I saw patients drop their blood pressures to near zero. There were many times where I had to push some serious drugs like atropine, epinephrine, antiarrhythmics, other things like that on certain patients. And we were ready to do that. When Deborah told me, Deborah in 97, I remember Deborah, I didn't know Howard Lotzoff, I didn't know Dana. She told me that Howard was the devil. And if I ever spoke to any of these people, she would not allow me to work with her, Once I realized this data wasn't going to be published, I went around, I said, I'm going to tell the whole world everything I learned by my years of experience treating these 300 and something patients with Ibogaine. And now one of the deals we made at the end of St. Kitts, a gentleman by the name of Hector Garza was willing to donate $2 million towards Deborah's St. Kitts project. If she and I would train her 2 Mexican doctor nephews on how to give Ibogaine. One of those doctors was Dr. Alberto Sola, who I have the utmost respect for. And Alberto Sola has been running Clear Sky, and I believe they've been open for 14, 15 years now. And it's the only Ibogaine clinic I know that has been actually following strict safety protocols. So Clear Sky has never actually killed anybody, but still, even at Clear Sky, there were patients who took flood doses of Ibogaine who needed to go to emergency rooms for short visits, 24 hours, usually, nothing serious. But there were things that were happening to them that scared the doctors enough that they wanted these patients to be in a hospital setting because of some wacky cardiac arrhythmias. So I started to advise everybody who was doing Ibogaine treatments that patients need intravenous access, patients need to be on a cardiac monitor. Somebody needs to be at the bedside who is not only advanced cardiac life support certified, so you can take the course, but if you've never run a code blue or actually, if you can't identify these complex cardiac arrhythmias, if you cannot tell torsades from VTAC, you probably shouldn't be doing treatments. Yet, most of the Ibogaine, many Ibogaine clinics have existed over the last 20 years. I would say 98% of those clinics were not run by physicians, MDs, addiction doctors who were ACLS certified. Most of them were well-intentioned people who got saved by Ibogaine and wanted to save other people by Ibogaine. So let me tell you right now, Ibogaine in general, even at flood doses, is a pretty damn safe drug. Even with all this cardiac risk and everything associated with it, if you do proper pre-treatment screening, you can avoid most of the adverse reactions. So when I've heard some statistics that there's a 1% to 3% mortality rate, for Ibogaine flood doses in untrained hands. I don't believe that number is actually that high. So what do I mean by proper pre-screening? A physician meets with the patient. The patient has labs done. Those labs include everything from, complete blood count to blood chemistries to serum magnesium to make sure that they don't have diabetes, an EKG to make sure they don't have cardiovascular disease. And sometimes if I think a patient is at risk for cardiac arrhythmias, we will put on something called a Holter monitor, or now something called the ZIO monitor, ZIO, which can take a 24-hour cardiogram for up to 1 day to 7 days in a row. So I can see, is this patient having any arrhythmias prior to Ibogaine? Because if they are, they're probably not a good candidate to be taking Ibogaine. So, and also making sure that your patient does not have any schizoaffective disorders. And then next, also, if you're treating patients with Ibogaine, drug test, drug test, drug test. We test the patients at that pre-screening to see what drugs they're on and to make sure, people tend to underestimate their habits or lie about this. They're so desperate to take Ibogaine. Ibogaine doesn't work for benzodiazepine addictions. And they're afraid that if they tell the doctor that they're also addicted, they're taking 8 milligrams of Xanax a day, they won't be able to be led into they won't get their Ibogaine treatment. And I do not say to patients who are addicted to benzodiazepines and opiates at the same time that you cannot take Ibogaine. But I do keep them on those benzos through their Ibogaine treatment, and at least we can get them off opiates, and then they live to fight and do a slow benzo taper back in the United States by slowly decreasing the dose of that medication over 6 to 12 months. And when you say when patients go to a treatment center, they need to be searched. Well, addicts are very clever, Dana. I've seen patients hide their drugs inside a computer where literally they had to unscrew 16 little screws from the back of the Mac. If somebody wants to sneak a drug into the clinic, they can do it. If they can get drugs into prisons, they could certainly get drugs into an Ibogaine clinic. So let's say a patient tells me they're doing street fentanyl. Within that first 24 hours, I'm going to give them morphine, their first dose of morphine. Okay, they're going into withdrawal. They've arrived in whatever country it might be, Mexico, Russia, whether it's one of the Bahamas, St. Kitts, one of the places, countries that allows them to do an Ibogaine treatment. And they say, hey, I'm going into opiate withdrawal. Sometimes when the plane lands, we go to pick them up at the airport. We actually have a dose of morphine in hand because that plane trip may be 6-7 hours to get to where they're going, and they're dope sick by the time they land. The last thing I want anybody to do is be arrested, by customs on the way into an island like St. Kitts or Mexico for narcotic possession. So we strongly advise people, do not bring any drugs with you. We will keep you comfortable. But by me putting, so some people may be taking oxycodone, somebody may be on methadone, some may be on Suboxone, some could be using heroin, some could be using street fentanyl, some may be taking kratom, and now there are some other synthetic opiates which are available on the dark net, drugs you've never even heard of, but will get people massively addicted. So when I'm giving them this morphine around the clock, I get a feeling and an idea of just how big their habit is. Does it take 100 milligrams of morphine per 24-hour period divided up into 6 different dosages to keep them comfortable? Or does it take 200 milligrams of morphine? But by putting every patient on morphine and watching them for several days prior to take their flood dose, I get a pretty good idea as an Ibogaine administrator as to how much Ibogaine I need to kill this opiate habit. So for instance, if somebody's going to need more than 200 milligrams of morphine a day just to be comfortable, they're going to need a flood and probably need some booster doses afterwards because it's a very, very large habit. I may not be able to kill that with a flood. If they're on long-acting drugs like methadone, Suboxone, MS-Contin, patients have to be off long-acting opiates for at least 2 to 3 half-lives of that drug before you can give them Ibogaine. Otherwise, we have opiates in their system competing for the same receptor site that noribogaine may be competing for. So and we're not trying to detox patients. So let's say the patient comes in and they need 100 milligrams of morphine a day to stay comfortable. So we're dividing that by 6 and giving them that dose every 4 hours around the clock till the day they're going to take their Ibogaine. Now, typically I dose in the morning, some people dose in the evening. So if a patient's going to take their flood dose at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, their last dose of opiates will be midnight the night beforehand. But a mistake a lot of places try to do is they try to taper that opiate dose while they're holding the patients for 4 or 5 days prior to the flood. And Dr. Mash would try to do this, and the patients would get restless and uncomfortable and show kind of drug-seeking behavior. And I would say to her, if you believe Ibogaine works, why are you trying to taper them? Okay. If a patient needs 80 milligrams just to be comfortable and straight and not, be a disruptive patient, then you need to give them that amount right up to the day of, 12 hours prior to the day of treatment or even 8 hours. So let's talk about Ibogaine deaths. Dr. Alper, Ken Alper from NYU, he's not an Ibogaine administrator, but Ken has been an ally of mine now for some 20 years. So I noticed certain other things on the EKG about Ibogaine that nobody else in the world had noticed. Aside from the QT prolongation, aside from the bradycardia, aside from the hypotension, which are very, very easy things to manage, I noticed that the T wave on the EKGs are made up of specific waves, PQRST, and the T wave represents that time it takes the heart to reset. And typically a T wave looks like a perfect sine wave. This T wave will become inverted, biphasic, and literally disappear. And they didn't understand why. Dr. Mansford tried to tell me this didn't exist, and yet I have many, many strips. I sent them to Dr. Alper, and Ken Alper seems to have found the answer that it's something called HERG blockade, HERG. Other drugs do cause HERG blockade, like thorazine, antipsychotics, but I believe that that Ibogaine may be the most potent hERG blocker in all of cardiology. But interesting, so if a patient is in a regular hospital on a cardiac monitor and their T wave gets flat or disappears, the doctor is going to think that patient is hypokalemic, low on serum potassium, and give that patient potassium. But yet, although the T waves on many Ibogaine patients will completely disappear, their serum potassiums are absolutely normal. So is there any consequence to this hERG blockade in terms of health risks to patients dying? I don't see any yet. It's an interesting phenomenon. More research needs to be done on it. But when I see these T waves disappearing and then they come back. Now, this is of great value to me because I know as soon as the Ibogaine is starting to be metabolized and the patient is starting to have their visual experience, I see these T wave changes start to appear. So I propose this experiment. You put a patient in what room, and I never see the patient, and I'm just looking at a cardiac monitor in another room. By looking at that EKG, I'll be able to tell you exactly when their trip is starting, when they go into the integral phase or the processing phase where the visuals are gone and now they're left to, think about the experience they're had. They're still under the effect of Ibogaine, but it's a different part of the Ibogaine experience because that T wave starts to go back to normal. And when I see that T wave is completely exactly as it was before I gave them Ibogaine, which usually will take a minimum of 12 hours, 8 to 12 hours, I know it's safe and their blood pressure is back to normal and their pulse is normal. I know it's safe to unhook the IV and take them off the cardiac monitor and they can go back to their bed in their room and finish their experience. So initially, Dr. Alper wrote a case of about 16 Ibogaine deaths that had been recorded. I looked at every single one of those recorded deaths and they were extremely easily avoided had somebody done some minimal medical workup on these patients at all. There's a case of, I'm going to talk about the Julia Mulligan case. They call her the Three Miracles. She was a patient of, I believe, of Eric Tabb and Lex Kogan, where she had an eating disorder. Supposedly she had some labs done a week beforehand in New York City, but she went into torsades, a complete heart block, had to go to the hospital, got a pacemaker, temporary pacemaker put in, was cardioverted with electricity 3 times in the 3 days. And when she woke up, her addiction stopped and a lot of her psychiatric issues stopped. And she credited these guys as saving her life. And I told Julia, I said, Julia, you could have had your life saved and not have been cardioverted 3 times and had a pacemaker put in and this sort of thing. And we still have this debate to this day. She's an associate of mine. I just saw her at a conference. She's a wonderful young lady. But she still thinks this was proper Ibogaine treatment. So if anybody wants to see what I think proper Ibogaine treatment would look like in the US model, I'm going to refer them to MAPS Spring Journal of 2020, where I wrote an article called The Commercialization of Ibogaine. If Ibogaine was to be done in the United States with 0 mortality rate, how would it be done? If we used, everybody knows a procedure called a colonoscopy, okay? Every person who's 45, 50 years old gets a screening colonoscopy because colon cancer is the 3rd leading cause of death, cancer death, and it's 100% preventable. So we get this procedure called a colonoscopy where you're given minimal anesthesia. You go to the hospital, they stick a flexible scope up your rectum into your colon, and they cut out polyps, which are pre-malignant. But you don't get a colonoscopy from somebody who says, I've had a colonoscopy, so I can do a colonoscopy. And it's the same thing with Ibogaine. I can't take somebody who is not going to medical school, does not have advanced cardiac capabilities, knows anything about addiction, medicine in terms of how to keep somebody comfortable on morphine and things like this without overdosing them. So again, you can't give Ibogaine to somebody because you've taken Ibogaine without a lot of training. also, when you go to get a colonoscopy, you meet with the doctor first, and he needs to make sure that you're healthy enough to undergo that colonoscopy. So you have a set of blood tests, and you have an EKG done, and the doctor takes your physical, and he looks to see if you're on any medications, i.e., and let's say you're on blood thinners, those medications would need to be stopped because you might bleed if a polyp has to be removed. Then you show up for the day of your colonoscopy and you're getting anesthesia, which today is usually propofol or Demerol with Versed. So you're going to be unconscious and you're going to wake up and say it's over. There's an anesthesiologist present during that 15 minutes always of anesthesia, and there's an IV line in place. Why? Because during that anesthesia, anything can happen. And the gastroenterologist, he's not trained as a cardiologist to treat arrhythmias, but the anesthesiologist is. So there's always an anesthesiologist present to make sure if anything goes wrong on anesthesia, and stays there till the patient wakes up and is safe again. And if we use the same screening protocols we use for a colonoscopy for an Ibogaine treatment, and including things like repeated drug testing, I always do a drug test on the patient right before I give them Ibogaine. Why? How do I know that the patient hasn't been sneaking drugs in his system while he's been at my clinic? So if you believe the GWAS case was a case of Valium overdose, I tend to disagree. I don't want to see Anwar in jail, but that is not the whole story. I've spoken to the parents of that man who died. That was a case where the patient was not being cardiac monitored. And when he died in the bed, nobody was there to do ACLS. There was no line in place. No emergency meds could have been given. No code blue was run. And that is why Dr. Jiwa, who is a dentist, not a doctor, okay, let's be clear here, is facing charges. Do I think Anwar should be facing charges? Absolutely not. He has been doing this for years and he's trying to help people. So most of these people use the argument, Ibogaine might carry some very small inherent risk to it, but the risk of these people continuing to use illicit opiates in other countries is much, much higher than the risk of taking a flood dose of Ibogaine. So even if a patient dies and, Dr. Jiwa has been giving people Ibogaine for 15 years and he kills one patient in 15 years, he gets charged with manslaughter. Well, how many of those patients that he cured would not be alive today had he not given them Ibogaine? But the real, Ibogaine is never going to be legalized until we come up with a protocol where real medical physicians, give this drug in a flood dose in a protocol where nobody dies. So I like to say nobody needs to die from opiate overdose, and nobody needs to die under Ibogaine. I've received many calls because at one point, if you look at the webpage, there used to be an organization called GITA, Global Ibogaine Therapeutic Alliance. And I wrote an Ibogaine safety manual, a very cursory Ibogaine safety manual for them. And they put me down as their head of the ethics clinics. And every once in a while, I'd get an email from some parents who wanted to know why their son died in this clinic in the West Coast of Mexico or that clinic here and there. And I would try and reach out to the provider and ask them questions, what happened? And usually they were well-intentioned people. There's one clinic that allows me to talk about a case. I got a call from these parents and their son died at a clinic called Medicine Heart that was on the West Coast of Mexico. And the provider actually answered the phone and he was crying to me. He said, Jeff, I did Ibogaine. It saved my life. I took Ibogaine classes. I went to conferences. I learned everything I could about Ibogaine. We got labs on the patient. We got an EKG, but they didn't have a doctor present. They didn't have an intravenous line in place. They didn't have a cardiac monitor in place. And he said, all of a sudden the patient, and they weren't doing repeated sophisticated drug testing to know if the patient was addicted to any other drugs like benzos. And he said they were watching the patient but they had no cardiac monitor. The patient had what appeared to be a 1 to 2 minute seizure and then stopped breathing. Now, even when that happened, your clinic should be able to resuscitate, intubate, put that patient on a respirator, breathe for them, bring them back to life. just as anybody in the United States has a cardiac arrest and you call 911, the clinic must be able to do exactly what those paramedics can do. And this provider who said, no, we were not set up to do that. And they were very far away from, calling 911 and hoping that this patient's still going to be alive 15 minutes later when an ambulance arrives. He was crying to me on the phone. He said, Jeff, I shut down the clinic. I never did another treatment. And there's not a day in my life I don't think about that patient that, died under my watch. So this is a caution I give people. I am not here. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody like Dr. Jiwa, Eric, Lex, Sarah, anybody who tried to help people with Ibogaine, but this is 2022 coming up, guys. There is a way to do Ibogaine where nobody has to die. Every single Ibogaine death is an excuse used by the big pharmaceutical companies, by the DEA, by even the investors. Now we're in the psychedelic revolution. We're in the psychedelic, where everybody wants to own the rights to psychedelics. We just had a big conference in Miami called Wonderland. 3,000 people showed up for 2 days. And it's the first conference I've been to. I've been going to conferences with Dana for 25, 30 years. We used to be a group of maybe 50 people meeting in Dana Beale's basement. And then we had conferences in Europe where we had hundreds of people show up. And the last conference where we spoke at was ICAD in London before COVID hit, and we had thousands of people interested in Ibogaine. And Dana really has been there for day one. And Dana, the lecture you gave on the first day of this conference was the best I've ever seen you give. I want to give you kudos for that. It was a terrific lecture. There is a protocol that where Ibogaine can be done. It should be the standard protocol for Ibogaine treatment, because if you follow this protocol, I'm not saying I can make Ibogaine 100% safe, because nothing can be ever 100% safe. But with proper pre-screening, labs, EKG, even Holter monitoring when necessary, a very in-depth physical exam, psychosocial, medical history, repeated drug testing, IV access during treatment, cardiac monitoring during treatment, and a physician at bedside who is super certified in ACLS, in other words, knows how to treat every type of arrhythmia, hypertension, bradycardia. What do you do when things go wrong? What do you do if the patient has a seizure under Ibogaine? Those should be the minimal standards in my mind for Ibogaine treatment. And I'm hoping in the near future with the group I'm working with now to open up clinics that follow that model. In other words, we're going to keep the price point just as cheap as unmonitored Ibogaine, and yet we're going to be doing all treatments with safety protocol. The next question I'd like to ask to the group is, we talk about Ibogaine success. Is Ibogaine success when the patient leaves the clinic in Mexico or wherever the clinic may be, and they say, I'm no longer dope sick, I feel great? Or is success that the patient is clean 12 months later? So how sustainable? So when we say Ibogaine is a cure for addiction, unfortunately, I get way too many phone calls from patients who say, listen, I did Ibogaine and I paid $8,000 to $12,000, and I did it at some clinic in some town, usually in Mexico, and I relapsed. And I asked them, well, how long ago did you do Ibogaine? Some people relapse in 3 weeks, some people relapse in 3 months, some people actually relapse in 6 months. But I get way too many phone calls of people relapsing. Why? Nobody tells these patients. I've never seen any clinic, including Clear Sky, tell the patients what they have to do when they go home. Now, listen to the power of the statement, guys. I'm not saying it's the only way to stay clean, but I've been giving Ibogaine treatments to patients since I think I began in 1996, maybe early 97, to the present. And I guess those treatments are somewhere between 1,700 to 2,000, supervised Ibogaine treatments where I was there present. And I haven't had a single adverse event because I've adhered to these very strict criteria. And sometimes I have to tell a patient, you're not a candidate for Ibogaine. I'm sorry, there are other ways to get clean, but nobody can die under my watch, and they say, I don't care, I'll take the risk, because they're so desperate. But the problem is when we're trying to get Ibogaine legalized as the drug of choice for opiate, dependence and other drug dependencies, every single death hurts us. I'm hoping that soon the standard will be set. It's not that difficult to do. There are more and more young doctors, and this is very encouraging to me, more and more young doctors who are calling me all the time. Either they're doing their residencies, they've just finished their residencies. Some of them are psychiatrists, some of them are emergency room doctors, but doctors across all the fields that we need to be, because a good Ibogaine treatment does need a psychiatrist who knows addiction medicine, and does need a good ER doctor or cardiologist that can treat every arrhythmia to make this go right. And lots and lots of these doctors are calling me that they have the credentials and they're interested in being Ibogaine providers. So that's very, very encouraging for me in the future. That these young people, there will be enough people with credentials around the world, real physicians with MDs who have the skills to follow an Ibogaine safety protocol. Unfortunately now, if a patient is seeking Ibogaine, there aren't very many clinics around that do these safety protocols. Why? Because it would become very expensive for clinics to hire real physicians and buy a $20,000, $30,000 cardiac monitor to put each patient on, and then have somebody stand by the patient's bedside for 24 hours waiting, saying, yeah, this patient is safe now, unhook the IV and unhook the monitor. It almost becomes cost prohibitive unless you're getting a lion's share of the patients. But I really do believe by the end of 2022, there'll be several clinics set up that are following, what I like to call the Kamlet safety protocols. So to summarize, I've never heard of a single Ibogaine death, any death that's been reported to me in the last 27 years or whatever it might be. Let's see, 24 years or so, that could not have been avoided with by following these particular safety protocols. And that's in view of the fact that I still think Ibogaine in untrained hands is an incredibly safe drug. Yet the fact that there are, some 30 reported deaths that have been come to the attention of the powers that be, we don't know how many patients is that 30 out of 30,000 Ibogaine treatments or 300,000 Ibogaine treatments? What is the incidence and prevalence of death in Ibogaine under untrained hands? We don't know the answer to that because we don't know how many people have done Ibogaine all over the world, but every death stands out as a sore thumb. I'd like to make the motto for 2022 that nobody needs to die from opiate overdose and nobody needs to ever die because they need a flood dose of Ibogaine. I've also seen some of the clinics that were following safety protocols in order to try to make the treatment look safer, went to a low dose protocol. So Clear Sky right now, who used to give patients 800, 900, a full gram or sometimes more than a gram of Ibogaine in a single dose, will not give any patient more than 600 milligrams as their flood. And I'm sorry to say that 600 milligrams is not a high enough dose to kill an opiate habit completely. So these patients, and then they're followed by booster dosages for a series of days. These boosters could be anywhere from 100 to 200 milligrams, thinking that a smaller flood followed by boosters is the same as a large flood. But I referred a bunch of patients down to these clinics using this protocol, and too many of these patients came back to my office a week later stating they didn't feel well, they were back into narcotic withdrawal, and I had to use some other modalities to kind of assist them in their recovery. So why are they using this low dose protocol? Because it's an easier sell to a country like Canada or some other place than that, oh, we have a protocol that works and it's a lower dose protocol, so it's not as risky for morbidity or mortality because we're only giving 600 milligrams. I think that is absolutely the wrong path to pursue. The only thing I can say for sure is that a flood dose of Ibogaine, and when enough is given, will stop opiate dependence in less than 20, opiate dependence withdrawal and post-acute withdrawal symptoms in less than 24 hours. Does microdosing work? Is small dose working? Will microdosing and a slow opiate taper work? I haven't seen it work so far. Does Ibogaine cure Parkinson's disease? I haven't seen that with my own eyes. I just don't know. More research needs to be done in a legitimate research model. I think the future looks bright. We're facing some very staunch enemies here. I hear from the big money investors all the time, the guys who are putting, 10 million, $100 million into researching psilocybin and other psychedelics. They're afraid to get involved in Ibogaine research because Ibogaine's got this bad rap. Okay, it may have a bad rap, which is undeserved, again, because with the proper safety protocol, no one needs to die. And even without the safety protocols, it's a pretty damn safe drug. But it's the only substance on the planet, and it's the only psychedelic drug that seems to have any super effect on addiction, and is certainly the only substance in the universe that stops opioid withdrawal in less than 24 hours. So thank you for listening to me, and if anybody wishes to contact me at any time, I'm very easily accessible on Facebook, and my cell phone numbers are there. I'm open to talk to anybody about Ibogaine at any time. And God bless you all. And thank you, Dana, for putting on this conference, and Locksmith for hosting it.